program. Now, in the last half of verse 18, Paul gives his goal and his mission. He's telling why Christ has wrought these things through him. Look with me at Romans 15, verse 18. To make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed. Stop there for just a moment. To make the Gentiles obedient. Now, that's an interesting statement, isn't it? Obedient to what, we might ask? What is it that Paul was trying to get the Gentiles to obey? Did you know that Paul identifies that very clearly for us here? Most folks would think the law. He's trying to get the Gentiles to be obedient to the law. Not at all. Paul explains very clearly what he wants them to believe, to be obedient to. Right here in the book of Romans, he does so. In the first chapter and in the last chapter, in fact. In Romans 1 and in Romans 16, Paul tells us what he wants the Gentiles to obey. It's very important to see this because there are a lot of folks, as I said, who would say, let's obey the Word of God. But they don't bother to identify what portion of the Word of God is meant for their obedience. They just lump it all together and they come out with some sort of convoluted conglomeration of two very different programs mixed all together. Paul doesn't make a mistake here, folks. He very clearly identifies what the Gentiles are to obey. Look with me at Romans chapter 1, verse 5. By whom we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name. For obedience to, what does it say here? For obedience to the faith among all nations for his name. When you see the definite article, the faith, Paul has a specific belief system in place. He's not talking about faith in general. He's not talking about believing that there was a man named Jesus Christ. Paul identifies two things here. By whom we have received what? Grace. What kind of grace? Well, we know from Paul's other writings that he's talking about the distinctive grace that was given him. What grace is it, Paul? Ephesians 3:2. If ye have heard of the dispensation of the grace of God, which is given me to you word. Don't know if we have it on the board. We don't. Not only was a special dispensation committed to Paul, Paul was given that unique and special apostleship concerning that special dispensing that he was to be doing. He mentions both there in Romans 1. So what does he want the Gentiles to be obedient to? The faith. What he's telling us here is that we Gentiles in this dispensation are to obey that message of grace that was given to Paul for us. We're to obey the message of grace that Paul preached. That's why Paul said numerous times, be ye followers together of me. That's what we're to obey. Same thing Paul describes over in chapter 16, where he says in verse 25, and we'll see if we can pull it up here. Now to him that has power to establish or stabilize you according to my gospel, the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began. This is the unique truth for this age. It's called the mystery, the secret. Paul called it the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. In verse 26 he says, but now is made manifest. In other words, but now you know it, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of what? Faith. It was always the obedience of faith. It was never anything other than the obedience of faith. It wasn't obedience to the law of Moses in order to get those folks saved. It was simply the obedience of faith that was taking God at his word. It's always been taking God at his word. But if God told you to do something to show that to prove that you were taking him at his word, you would definitely do that thing. Today he's telling us to those who worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, that person's faith is counted for righteousness. So God is not giving you things today in order for you to have an opportunity to prove that you're taking him at his word or disprove that you're taking him at his word. Today our service comes not out of apprehension to any of those things. Our service today comes based solely on our appreciation for what Christ has already done. Christ fulfilled the law for us. So we're identified with the righteousness of Christ the moment we take God at his word, obedient to the faith concerning what Christ accomplished on our behalf. Paul called it the ministry of reconciliation. We should all understand what it is. God is reconciled where the sins of the world are concerned. Why? Because he imputed those sins to Christ. That all who would believe what he imputed to Christ, that resolved the sin issue forever, would be joined to the person of the Son and have his righteousness freely counted to them or imputed to their account. So that's what we're to obey today, the obedience of faith. The message committed to the apostle of the Gentiles, the Apostle Paul. Paul was given that unique body of truth for the age of grace. So you see, when Paul talks about his task here in chapter 15 is that of making the Gentiles obedient, he's not talking about obedience to the law of Moses. He's talking about obedience in regard to his special message, obedience in regard to his special and unique apostleship. He's not talking about obedience to all the Old Testament rules and regulations or obedience to the religious rituals and practices connected with God's program with the nation Israel in connection with their promise of the land. He's talking about obedience to the Pauline revelation.